Well, Stuart, thank you so much for helping me with my project. I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit about yourself.
Well, I'm a science fiction author. I've won a bunch of very impressive awards, Writers of the Future, Jim Bain Award. I've become a regular in Analog Science Fiction and Fact magazine, which still I just can't believe I get to say that.
That's awesome. And I was wondering, when did you find out that NASA is planning to send astronauts to the moon in 2024?
Well, I've heard kind of dates jumping around for a long time. I honestly think I may have heard the 2024 announcement from you at one of the National Space Society meetings. Um, but it's been bouncing around in the pipeline for several years with the business about the lunar gateway and where they're going to go and was it going to be a different form and were they going to do a landing or should they go straight to Mars? I'm getting dizzy trying to follow all this stuff.
So how confident are you that we'll actually be going to the moon at some point this decade?
This decade, so like by 2030,
Yeah.
I think that's a fairly good bet, but it depends on what you mean by going to the moon. I think it's a safe bet that we will be sending people to orbit the moon within this decade. I think it's a fairly safe bet that we'll have some form of lunar gateway in orbit around the moon, for better or worse, by the end of the decade. Now, these more ambitious goals about landing people on the moon, man, I don't know. 10 years ago, I would have said it's absurd in that sort of time frame. But 10 years ago, we didn't have Elon Musk down in South Texas blowing up rocket ships every other 2 weeks. So
Yeah, and they're making really good progress.
yeah,
I did see though that the FAA is saying that their uh, environmental survey needs to be updated because they originally understood that they were only going to be launching Falcon 9s and and Falcon Heavies and not these humongous
yeah,
rockets.
yeah. The FAA, yeah. When you said BFR, we thought that was just hyperbole.
We didn't realize you would have like so many gallons of
This is
liquid methane.
SpaceX boldly starting wildfires where no man has started wildfires before.
Exactly. Luckily, there's a lot of water nearby.
Yeah. Well, I guess it's not that unprecedented, though. I mean, if you go back and look at the history of space back in the early days before Jet Propulsion Laboratory, when when the university out there was doing rocket testing in what I think I can't remember what they called it, but basically it was like a gorge or a gully that nobody was around, and at the time it was an uninhabited area and they ran their rocket out there, and I saw something recently that they're saying all that stuff's gone now because now it's like suburbs and you couldn't you couldn't do that anywhere near there.
But so my goal is to do an interview with a different person every single day till the end of 2024.
Yeah, so
Based,
you're a fan of ambitious manned undertakings.
I'm a fan of a lot of quixotic adventures. We all have our windmills. Um,
Yeah,
but part of the reason why is because I feel like the 2020s are going to be like what the 1990s were to the internet. So the 2020s to space would be like the 1990s to the internet. It really feels like there's a lot of capacity and ambition and drive that between China, the U.S., Russia, and India, and private space is really building up, and that we might actually see real
yeah,
tangible expansion of the human space into outer space. And I thought this would be a good way to kind of capture people's um, awareness of that and kind of like their thoughts and attitudes as we kind of enter into that period. So
yeah.
that's sort of my thoughts. But in terms of that awareness thing, out of the 200 interviews I've done so far, I would say maybe about 35 knew that we were going to the moon in 2024. And in fact, one
Really?
person said, why is NASA keeping it a secret? And I was just wondering, if you had to if you had to kind of guess on why people aren't aware of it, what would be your thought?
Well, you know, I've actually had this conversation with more than a few NASA people. You know, I write a lot for Quora, and I write a lot about rocketry and rocket science because I'm a writer and I need effective ways to procrastinate. And I often get I went through a period where I found myself writing a lot of articles explaining to people what NASA does and what it was actually created to do, which isn't what most people think. NASA was not created to go to the moon. It was not created to build the Saturn V rocket. Going to the moon was a project that was given to NASA because it had been created to do these other things. And actually what NASA is today is an evolution of NACA, which was created back in the 1930s to develop the aerospace industry. And what NASA was really designed to do, if you read the enabling legislation, is to develop the aerospace industry into space. And most people don't know about that. And they don't know about, you know, the grooved concrete that makes roadways safer and anti-slip brakes and all the millions of other things that NASA does. And so the question comes up when I write about these things, people say, why don't we know about that? Why doesn't NASA get the message out? And so I've asked that question of NASA personnel, and they all tell the same thing. NASA's not allowed to do PR. It's just as simple as that. It's part of their culture, and it's part of their interpretation of their own enabling legislation. They do um, they do spend money on reports that are meant to share what they do with industry, but it's hard for them to justify or get approval to go, you know, have an ad campaign or to fund a documentary or something like that. If somebody else is doing it, they can cooperate. But NASA doesn't have a PR department to go out and ring their own bells. And if you don't mind me continuing on this bigger
Please,
little thing, what we're seeing right now with SpaceX, you know, think whatever you want of Elon Musk and Jeff Bezos and the fact that you have, you know, billionaire oligopolists who have the resources to spend on this kind of thing. The fact that we have SpaceX blowing up rocket stages right and left in South Texas, the fact that we have a spaceport developing in South Texas, the fact that we have private companies launching things into space from South Texas, Middle Texas, the, you know, Cape Kennedy and other places, is NASA getting back to its roots. The other thing that I've seen a lot of people ask online is, in particular, thinking about the SLS, is NASA obsolete? Do we not need NASA anymore now that we have SpaceX? But again, it was never NASA's job to build a Saturn V. They did that because there was no one else. If NASA can get SpaceX to develop rockets at a fraction of the cost, that's what they should be doing. If they could have made that happen in the 70s, by God, they should have done it in the 70s. Most people didn't think it was possible. I don't think it was possible. And so they did the shuttle. But if you look at what SpaceX has done with the Falcon 9 and the Falcon Heavy, and you compare that dollar for dollar or dollar per pound to orbit to what the government did back in the 60s, it's unbelievable, the payback. I don't have the numbers, you know, readily at hand, but um, I think I looked at it one time and it was something like 300 to 1 if you look at the cost per pound orbit um, for a Falcon 9 compared to some of the early missiles that were developed by the hold on a second.
sure thing.
That's my family being cooperating with all this.
Oh, I understand. You could imagine kind of like the family pressure of trying to get one of these done every day until the end of 2024.
Yeah, I'm sure it's fun. I'm sure you have learned how to use some basic editing software. Anyway, what I was saying is, if you look at the performance of the Falcon 9, if you look at what the amount of public money that's gone into that, and look at the performance for the rocket. It's unbelievable the difference between what SpaceX has gotten accomplished and what the government development projects did in the 60s. And, to be fair, part of the reason for that is because in the 1960s, absolutely everything about rocketry was new and high tech and cutting edge. But also part of it is because in the old days, these launch systems were being developed in the old in the same way that military weapon systems are developed. NASA would let out a bid. They would say, we need a ship that can do this much, and we'll pay you what it costs, basically. And if you convince us that you can do it for an amount that we can pay, then you'll get paid. So it's a cost plus contract. If you have overruns, we'll pay for the overruns. Well, that's great if your goal is to get to the moon by the end of the decade without getting somebody killed. That's ridiculous if your goal is to do anything sustainable, anything affordable. What what SpaceX has done is, under programs that were started under the Bush administration, to get NASA back to those roots, to get NASA to fund the type of competitive programs that the Gutenberg Foundation did back in the 30s and that NACA did in the early days, where they said, basically, we're not going to let a contract and then pay you cost plus. We're going to have a contest, or we're going to have a mini contract that gets you to demonstrate your capability. And then as you build up that capability, we're going to narrow the field. And at a certain point, we're going to say, hey, now that you're at the point where you can launch stuff into space, we'll let you compete for a contract to do something that we want you to do. So the big difference that's going on right now today that people don't see is these two astronauts that are on the ISS, as you and I are talking right now, did not launch on a NASA rocket. They were passengers on a SpaceX rocket. NASA paid for a taxi ride. That is a huge difference, because it is in SpaceX's interest to make that taxi ride as cheap as they possibly can. And they've done a pretty good job of it.
Now, and NASA wasn't completely hands off, like you mentioned. They
Right.
had the initial kind of like requirements and constraints. They had a number of companies and teams apply. They
Yeah, yeah,
had 4 people that made it to the first round. I think like Sierra Nevada, Blue Origin, SpaceX, and
yeah,
Boeing. And then they were paid so much for that stage, and then they had to go through a few more rounds, and it got narrowed down to 2. Boeing and
yeah,
SpaceX, and they both have hardware,
yeah.
and one of them's flown astronauts. So
Yeah.
it's really kind of a neat thing.
And another thing that people miss sometimes is you could look at what's going on right now and you could say, well, should the government be spending money on SLS when we have Starship? Well, okay, putting aside the fact that we don't actually have Starship yet, should the government be spending money on what isn't the clear winner? Well, yes, because that's exactly where you need to spend public money. If we knew right now what was the cost-effective, most economical way to make money in space, NASA wouldn't need to be involved, right? The stock market would take care of it. The space fund would take care of it. We're still at the point now where we're figuring out. So you mentioned Sierra Nevada. Sierra Nevada has a sort of a mini shuttle, which is, in my mind, a lot closer to the original design for the space shuttle, which most people think was a pretty intelligent design before it got jumbo sized and turned into that somewhat ridiculous thing that we all know and love. It remains to be seen at this point whether that's the right way to get people into space, or whether it's a cost-effective way. Um, they've done pretty well. They're still around. NASA has given them enough wins and enough contracts that they're still plodding along. So we'll see. Maybe in 10 years, tourists will be riding Sierra Nevada mini shuttles up to hotels in orbit for an affordable price. And maybe SpaceX Super Heavies will be launching the hardware for the hotels. We don't know yet.
Yeah, and I don't know about Sierra Nevada's Dream Chaser being the right way to get into space, but in terms of getting back from space, it definitely has one superior capability in the sense that you could pretty much land it at any airport.
Right. Yeah.
So if you have astronauts that need to get to the hospital quickly, as opposed to landing in sea, waiting to be picked up, waiting to, um, you know, get someplace, you can actually land directly at
And
an airport.
and it's interesting to remember too that in part because of this government investment in hold on one second. This is our little wannabe astronaut here begging at the door.
I like them.
Here,
Astro.
sit down there and be quiet, little buddy. You see, I'll wag my tail, but I won't be quiet. Um, but it's interesting if you look at the SpaceX capsule. It's using heat shields for its back shell, or excuse me, it's using shields for its primary heat shield that are basically the old Apollo heat shield technology. But NASA contracted SpaceX to do the research for improving the design to make it cheaper to manufacture and to make it reusable. Then their tiles on the back shell, and I believe this is also true, well, it's certainly true for Orion. The Orion capsule, the heat tiles on the back shield are basically space shuttle tiles. But what we've learned from the space shuttle is that you shouldn't perhaps use ultra delicate tiles on the leading edge, most critical heat shield. But they're great for the back shell where nothing, they can be protected, and um, weight is more of a concern. So you have this jumping back and forth of technology between um, entrepreneurial approach and government approach, and you learn a little bit here and you learn a little bit there. Everybody was amazed when Elon Musk announced that they were going to use stainless steel for the Starship. No one more than I was. But then when you think about it, one of the first intercontinental ballistic missiles that was really a success used stainless steel for the tanks. They were balloon tanks, but it's not like this is an impossible thing that nobody's ever considered before. And what Elon Musk is trying to do is what I used to always complain to people during the shuttle era, that when we built the space shuttle, we started with the bright idea that it'd be more economical to go into space if we had a reusable spacecraft. And so we made having a reusable spacecraft the goal. But the goal wasn't to make a reusable spacecraft. The goal was to make an economical spacecraft. And so what Elon Musk is trying to do is say, look, you can do it however you want. The spacecraft needs to be built in a shipyard, not in a clean room. I'm being a bit hyperbolic there. They're probably all built in clean rooms, but he's trying to get to the point where between additive manufacturing and 3D printing and the computer modeling that we have and the material science that we have now, that you can build something that isn't operating at the absolute edge of failure all the time, which was the case in the 1960s. To my knowledge, there was never a Saturn launch that literally wasn't within seconds of failure. They just made sure that the failure occurred after the engines cut off.
Ah, that's cool. Of course, I mean, they did have some interesting incidents. The one that got struck by lightning multiple times, and then
Yeah.
they had one, I think, one of the 5 engines in the first stage cut out early, and they had to burn the other 4 a little longer.
Well. So that's what I'm talking about, right? So I believe it was Apollo 13 was the second flight to have that engine. The Apollo 12 post-flight analysis indicated that that engine was on the verge of failure. On Apollo 13, it actually did fail, and what they had done is they had changed the sequencers to make it cut off early so that it wouldn't fail,
Hmm.
and it failed anyway. And so for Apollo 14, they made it cut off a little earlier. So in the movie Apollo 13, they're like, oh, we lost that engine. Are we still able to make it in orbit? And what people don't realize is, yeah, on Apollo 14, it had already deliberately been cut off by that point. But that's what I mean. Those ships were military vessels. Spend any amount of money to get the mission done. That's great if you need to get the mission done, but you were never going to colonize space that way. Can you imagine taking a vacation at Disney World if if Boeing was cutting off engines on a 747 because they're about to explode, because they are running at the absolute limits of no. So when SpaceX started recovering their ships, one of the first things that people said is, well, you're losing a lot of your payload capacity, saving enough fuel to come back and land, aren't you? Well, yes, but you're saving a crap ton. Elon Musk is doing the right thing. He's looking at the cost of operating the thing and not just getting the maximum performance that's possible to be had.
Yeah, and that's a very interesting point. I noticed that Tori Bruno, the CEO of ULA, he had posted something about how satellite launchers, they want to launch, in a matter of months, but it takes them like 2 years to prepare for a mission. So having a
Yeah,
stockpile of first stages and what is it, payload fairings, at least gives you like 95% of what you need to launch something. You only have to build the second stage.
yeah,
Um, but
yeah,
the other thing is
yeah,
about safety. You know, I'm sure that those Apollo era people would have really liked to have seen the failed hardware, and to inspect the actual physical held hardware, right? I mean, reusability isn't just
yeah.
about economics, it's also about being able to see the state of your equipment after it's been used and to know, to be able to find things that you couldn't ever put enough
Yeah.
telemetry into the vehicle to actually detect.
Well, and if you look at any other industry, I mean, if you look at like some of the YouTube videos of people who work on jet engines, and we have jet engines that have been the same type of engine has been in use for 50, 60 years now. And we've been learning things about them for 50 or 60 years. So, they learned in the 1940s, the alloys that they were making the turbine blades out of weren't up to it. And then later they learned how to make so that they didn't have any grain that could cause force concentrations and cause them to fail. Well, in the mid 1950s, that meant those were fabulously expensive, right? Because there was only one company in the world that knew how to make those turbine blades. Now you can just order them from China, and any of 100 companies can make them. But now you want them coated with ceramic and with special high performance ducts through the turbine blades to keep them cool and all. So what constitutes high technology is a moving target. I mean, 12,000 years ago, the ability to grow a field of corn would have been considered high technology.
Indeed. What magical powers are these?
Exactly. Or, oh, look, I can spray this thing here and kill all the fungus on a field. Woo!
Wizard!
Yeah.
Wizard! But can he
So yeah,
swim? No, I'm
yeah.
just kidding.
So that's that's part of it too, to be alive if you're interested in space. Because when I was a kid, when I was really little, we were going to the moon, and it was like, man, that's the future. And then by the time I was in high school and I was old enough to read up on how we got to the moon, I'm like, dude, this is never going to be practical. But now technology has progressed to the point that a lot of the things, not all of the things, but a lot of the things that we imagined back then are really not impossible anymore. I mean, the idea of ordinary people jetting into low Earth orbit to have a vacation at a hotel, I think you and I are going to live to see that for sure. I don't know where the price point is going to get to be, but it's going to happen.
Well, I mean, it's
Um,
already there. It's $55 million dollars to take the SpaceX rocket.
yeah, yeah.
Probably like 80 million to take the Soyuz, both of which are now available to you.
And if Elon Musk really is able to build a starship with the performance that he has in mind, um, I'm I honestly think his talk about a colony on Mars, I really think that's overly ambitious, because building a rocket that can send payloads to Mars is the easy part of building a colony. There's way other stuff that there's a lot of science that's got to be done, and it will be done, and it'll be fascinating to watch. But I don't think you're going to have a million people sign up in the next 50 years and go start a colony on Mars. I don't think that's realistic. However, you could build a colony on the moon, and that colony on the moon could do useful things, which, you know, we could spend 2 hours talking about that. But even short of that, if you build a hotel in orbit and you can send 100 people or 300 people if you're only going into low orbit or Earth orbit, now the concept of doing something like a cruise ship in orbit is not an unreasonable thing. So, you know, and that's just me, you know, talking off the top of my head, but the economics really are transformative. I mean, if you look at I think the space shuttle was costing something like well, I don't want to say the numbers because I'll get them wrong and I'll look like an idiot. But the space shuttle was so expensive to get something into orbit that there was just no way you were going to do anything that wasn't subsidized by the government. But you and I have talked to people at NanoRacks who are now able to literally put real science experiments in orbit that were paid for by an elementary school bake sale.
Oh, and
That's
now you could
Robert
put
Heinlein type of stuff there.
stuff on the moon next year on
Yeah.
Astrobotic DHL Moonbox
Yeah,
for
so I went to Spacecom last year, and I was talking to a fellow who had I want to say it was Axiom. Does Axiom have a lunar lander? Am I thinking of the right
um
company?
I don't think Axiom does. You know, they have, you know, they're the ones that are going to be doing the private module on the International Space Station. That'll be a free
Okay,
floating.
I may be thinking of the wrong one, but anyway, there was a company there that had a lunar lander that is basically propellant tanks and an engine and propulsion modules, and you hang the payloads on the outside of the thing, and it is designed to get not people but to get payloads to the moon as cheap as you possibly could. And I'm talking to him, and as a science fiction writer, I'm thinking, you know, you could carry a guy in a spacesuit. Just duct tape to the outside of this thing.
I was it Intuitive Machines by chance?
I don't remember now.
Because they were at Spacecom last year. They had their Nova C lander prototype
I
there.
remember it was really tall. It was
Okay,
towering. That may have been it.
yeah, yeah, I think so because they're landing on the moon next year, and we actually had Trent Martin from Intuitive Machines come and speak at our North Houston Space Society meeting in December. And the other company that's landing on the moon is Astrobotics.
Yeah.
And we're having a speaker from them come speak to us virtually in August. So
Yeah.
I'm pretty excited about that. We got both of them.
Astrobotics is carrying the rover, right?
Yes, but that's in 2023.
Yeah.
Next year, they're just having a lander with similar type of setup
Yeah.
as Intuitive Machines.
See, that's exciting stuff too. The concept that there could be ice primordial ice hidden in polar regions of the moon on an industrially exploitable scale. That's significant. I remember, I guess it was in the 80s now, NASA contracted somebody to do a study on silane propellants, which was the idea that you could make rocket propellants from materials that just exist in the lunar crust. And it can be done, but there's all kinds of problems with it, and it didn't raise very much interest. But if you have ice, and you can send robots down into the cold, dark pit of hell to pull the ice out. Well, hell, we know how to make propellants out of ice. That's not, and oh, by the way, air, small detail.
Oh yeah, I know, but it's not just water ice. I mean, you could potentially have ammonia ice
Yeah,
and
yeah, yeah.
a whole bunch of other really cool stuff down there. You might even have prehistoric life that's been frozen and preserved in some way.
Interestingly enough, you could conceivably have prehistoric life from Earth
Yes.
preserved down there.
Oh, exactly. I mean, who knows exactly when um, the life developed versus the moon
And
kind of hitting the
and
Earth.
and and you know, and that's a fascinating thing too, because I mean, even putting aside notions of, you know, civilian industry and mining and that kind of stuff, um, you'll often get like the moon hoax people saying, if we really went to the moon, why haven't we been back? And it's like, have you seen the budget for the moon program? It was really, really expensive. But now, I mean, Jiminy Cricket, if NASA said, look, we forget sending people to the moon, we want to send a fleet of robots to go search for fossils in the polar regions of the moon, and here's $20 billion over the last 20 years, next 20 years. We could make it happen. We could absolutely make it happen. And you know, $20 billion, that's a month of a small war somewhere. That's not that much money in today's, you know, today's dollars. It's not anything like the scale of the Apollo program. The Apollo program did fantastic work. It is, in my opinion, it is one of the greatest achievements, if not the greatest achievement in the history of our species. But a great deal of what they did, they did the best they could with the technology that was available at the time. And if you look at, you know, things like, it's funny now, you look at the SpaceX capsule and they got this glass cockpit, it's all pretty, and they got a graphical user interface, and the glass works with spacesuit gloves. On Apollo, they had a panel, and if they wanted to change what displayed on that panel, they had to turn a knob. And if they turned the knob to the wrong position, they wouldn't see a whole section of information that could be critical to keeping them alive. I mean, that was the technology they were working with. And people talk about the Apollo guidance computer. The Apollo guidance computer was awesome, but my brother's calculator in 1978 could kick the pants off the Apollo guidance computer.
Indeed. Indeed. I think it also, though, you know, it really shows you how completely understood the system was end to end, right? I mean, you could
Yep,
literally have all your engineers know how the entire thing worked.
pretty much, yeah.
Whereas now it's like layer on layer and layer, and everybody's like an expert in their layer, but the full stack of
But on the
technology.
other hand, today you can you can model the whole system in a computer. So it's kind of paradoxical, right? I mean, Um, I talked to a guy at Lockheed Martin back in the 90s who said that the first terabyte database he'd ever seen, he was a IBM consultant, and he said the first terabyte database that he had seen was at Lockheed Martin when they built I want to say the F-18. And he said that was the first airplane that they never had to build a prototype of the airplane. I mean, they built prototypes for various other reasons, but when they built the first prototype, they knew it would fly and they knew how its performance would be because it was all modeled in the computer. And a lot of people who've grown up in that world don't realize that that wasn't true of Apollo. That wasn't true of Mercury or Gemini. It wasn't true of the space shuttle.
I
The
know they
space
wanted to
shuttle,
see how it would actually work inside of Airstream. They built a wind tunnel and they put the thing in it.
or in the case of the space shuttle, they built a cannon that could fire objects at hypersonic velocity through a gas medium to simulate what it would do in the atmosphere. And then they built a space shuttle and prayed that their model would be accurate.
Yeah, it's we've definitely come a long way. Um, so I have a question. You know, one of the questions I ask people is, where does space, what do they think about space? And of course, you always have the opportunity cost argument. You know, why are we spending money on space when we could spend money on X, Y, and Z, like feeding people, you know, environment, whatever. Um, and I was wondering how you sort of respond to that question.
Well, I mean, it's a valid question, but you know, when people ask that question, I say, well, what's the value of the NFL? What's the value of the movie industry? What's the value of being married and having kids? I mean, if you're not interested in knowing how the world works, I don't know how to explain it to you. I mean, to me, that is what being a human being is all about. And if you want to take a more spiritual view of it, you know, God created us with this amazing thing that no other creature has, this mind that can look at the world and understand it, look to the future and understand it, plan for things, prepare for things. You know, from a spiritual perspective, I've got to figure that you know, any God that created us in His own image is waiting for the day when we come knocking, presumably politely, on the door and saying, "We're here. Did we miss something? Are we?"
Well, and I mean, I don't know how maybe like Jesus's parables might fit into your spirituality, but there is this one parable he told about the landlord going off on a trip, and he gives like some money to three of his servants. One of them like 50 things of gold, another one like 20, another one like 10, and he goes off and he comes back, and the one that had 50 doubled it, and the one that had 20 doubled it, but the last one like just hit it in the ground, and I like to also make the argument from that standpoint of, we're expected to do something with what we have, you know.
So I didn't realize that Jesus told a parable of income elasticity. That's what that is. But that's good. But yeah, I mean, and from a more practical perspective, the again, it goes back to, you know, the people who say, oh, why does the government spend $10 million on a toilet? Well, because no one else is going to, because there's not an obvious payback. And oh, by the way, and I'm just using that as an example because William Proxmire used to complain about that. I don't know how much the government actually spent on toilets, but I know that a great deal of money was spent on toilets so that we could have low flush toilets that actually work, which are available today. And that's just one of millions of examples of that kind of thing, right? Um, um, you know, going back to what I was talking about earlier about the things that NASA does that most people don't know, every long haul trucker on the American highway today has a cowling that cuts its fuel consumption by 30%.
Hmm.
Those cowlings exist because an employee at Ames Research Center used to always get blown off the road on his motorcycle when he passed a truck. And he thought to himself one day, you know, we have wind tunnels, we can solve this problem. And he went and talked to his boss at Ames and he said, yeah, you know what, I think we can allocate some money to that. And they did it. And now it's a whole industry. And of course, now NASA doesn't do it. There are all these other companies that do it, sometimes using NASA facilities. You never know what the payback is going to be from basic research until you do it and you move down the road. Um, you know, I always tell people, you know, NASA didn't invent Velcro and they didn't invent the space pen, but they did accelerate the development of microcomputers probably by a decade. They accelerated the development of battery technology by a decade. They gave us compact fluorescent lights a decade earlier than we might otherwise have had them, and on and on and on and on. And the same will be true with, you know, with what we're doing now. You can't put a price on pure technological development, but then when you get beyond that, once the technology reaches a certain inflection point, then the markets come in and start looking for things to do, which is a good segue to another topic that I know we've talked about before at the National Space Society, which is Starlink, which is going to be this massive constellation of low altitude satellites that will give everybody on Earth high-speed internet and probably create the Earth's first trillionaire. That's something that, you know, Arthur C. Clarke could not have envisioned in his wildest fantasies, but they're building it right now. And they're building it because of what we've been talking about SpaceX and putting cost per dollar or what it was, cost per pound to orbit ahead of any other esoteric goals about reusability or mission or whatever.
I was thinking that Starlink might be a key enabler for the end of cities, because rural land is generally cheaper than cities, and with Starlink you can have high-speed internet access anywhere, regardless, any rural area. With solar power, you have your power. You can have a full cycle water system, so you're able to pretty much reuse your water completely without having to replenish it. And then you have Amazon delivering any goods you need. And so, it'd be very easy to set up little communities
Yeah,
scattered throughout everything, and you don't have to worry about pandemics, and you don't have to worry about terrorist attacks, and you don't have to worry about geopolitical war and being the target of somebody's ICBM, and you
yeah.
don't have to worry about social unrest. So I'm just wondering what you think the future of cities are.
I mean that's a good question. The one thing that we know for certain is the future will change in ways that we can't predict. I mean, my grandparents probably would have said that by now everybody would be living the life of Ryan in a city with dirigibles flying overhead, and tube trains, and that hasn't panned out. Um, but part of the reason that today's cities are so denigrated, I think, is because of the way technology developed. At the time when we were moving into cities and moving to distributed energy that let us build factories all over and let us put our professional classes in a different place, in the downtown instead of where the factories were, um, we were switching to cars for transportation instead of trains and other forms of mass transit. Now I don't want to say we're shifting away from that, but we're shifting from that fossil fuel based mode of transport to an energy mode where the economics are different. And so I think that's going to change the way cities look in the future in ways that are as unpredictable as the fate of dirigibles were before they tried docking them to the Empire State Building at one time.
Yeah, I mean, could you also think, long range drones are able to deliver goods? If you're able to solve, I mean, the energy problem is solved through solar panels. Kind of like the expert worker problem might be solved through telepresence robots, and then the food problem could be solved through, you know, light weight food that could be kind of.
But also think about it. If you no longer have to drive anywhere, the whole way you look at transportation is different, right? If on the one hand, I saw a study back in the 90s that said, hey, in the future, we're going to build cars on these like generic electric platforms, and you'll just put any kind of car on top of it that you want, it won't matter. And the car will be self-driving and it'll be capable of getting you safely from point A to point B. And in fact, at a certain point, you won't even need seats or seat belts because all the cars will be cooperating and there'll be effectively no way for there to be a wreck, right? Unless like a plane crashes on the road. So you could imagine a world in which on your daily commute, you have a gym in your car and you work out on the way, right? Or you sleep late in the car, you have sex in the car or whatever. And just the whole way you approach it would change. But then when you think about it, if you live in that world, why would you commute at all, right? Because you'll have this other technology along with it. And I would extend that today. You're going to have self-driving cars. So I often joke that in my old age, I'm going to get a self-driving RV and I'm just going to go from one writer's convention to another, right?
Oh, exactly.
But at the same time, you're going to have self-flying drones that can take you where you need to go. So will the short hop commuter airlines even exist in the future? Will they realize the dream that we had in the 60s of the helicopter taxis, before there were some high profile crashes that put an end to that? And the answer is, I don't know, nobody knows, but a lot of entrepreneurs are going to find out for us in the next 10 or 20 years.
In fact, one of our NSS members, Gary Stevenson, he moved to California. He works for such a air taxi company called Aero, and they're starting up the first air taxi, single person flying company in New Zealand. They're actually
Yeah.
deploying that now. It's kind of interesting. It's
So I think things are going to change, and of course, as a science fiction author, I you know, people ask me these things. Is like I don't spend all day every day thinking about what the future is going to be like because it's just too exhausting. But when I'm working on a project, I'll sit down. So if I've worked on a project, I can answer the questions on that. But it doesn't take too much mental energy to think, you know, a lot of people like living in cities, but there are things about the city they don't like. And a lot of people hate living in the city, but there are things about the city they do like. So I think the true answer is probably that technology is going to be used to give both groups of people what they want, but at the same time, increasing artificial intelligence is going to be transforming the workplace in ways that are both good and not so good. And because of that, it's going to be transforming the economy in ways that are good and not so good. It's going to be an interesting time.
Yeah, I'm reading a book by Thomas Piketty called Capital, and it talks about increasing income inequality and how capital, seems to accumulate in the hands of fewer and fewer people.
Yeah,
And as you look at sort of the ability of like AI and kind of marketing and manipulation of news and people's perception, you just, I mean, I guess how do we avoid all the dystopian futures that we've imagined for
yeah.
ourselves?
Yeah, and the interesting question is, can we get to the future that a future that we can all live with in a non-destructive way? You know, there are some people who say, you know, that revolutions of one type or another are inevitable and are the only way of making change. Gosh, I'd like to not believe that that's the case, but one thing that is true is that I even think it's a bit of a misnomer to focus on, you know, capitalism versus communism. It's as simple as power tends to beget power. And it doesn't matter what the form of power is. It doesn't matter if it's economic power, political power, spiritual power. Power cannot be, society needs to have systems to limit the growth of power and propagation of power, or power will accumulate until it explodes. And I don't think there's any way around that. Unfortunately, in the United States, we we confused early on, I think, our focus on individualism and self-interest for being inoculated against the concentration of power. And we were never inoculated against the concentration of power in the way that many of us believed. And I think because of that, for the last 40 years in particular, our guard has been down, and we, you know, and as the Cold War tailed off, we all kind of coasted along. It's like, oh, we don't have to worry about nuclear war anymore. And the nuclear war, the threat of nuclear war was actually, I think, helping keep the concentration of power in certain ways from growing unabated. So something's going to have to be done about that. The question is, are we going to be smart and are we going to do something that benefits everybody, or are we going to be stupid and wait until the system fundamentally breaks and then rebuild something from the ashes? And that all depends on what type of story you like to write.
It's just barring some external threat that pulls us all together. It
Like a pandemic, for example.
you would think, and it worked for a month.
Yeah, well, it is unfortunate.
It worked for a month. Um, yeah, no, I think
Maybe
we're
we'll find aliens on the moon, and that'll give us that common enemy that we seem to need.
well, and even better than aliens. Evidence of aliens would be enough.
Yeah, yeah,
Some type of um, you know, big footprint or something.
yeah,
Um, so I mean, one of the values that people say about us going back to the moon is its inspirational value. And I think a lot of people are thinking about whenever Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin landed on the moon the first time, everybody around the world knew about it because we were all watching. Well, I wasn't. I was not born yet, 7 years later. Okay, anyway, um, Uh, and so the people I hear were watching on the TV, they were reading it on the newspaper and the magazine the next day, and a lot of people think we're going to have that moment again the next time we land on the moon. And I think based upon my research interaction with people some so far and thinking through it, I think a large number of people will probably be completely unaware of us landing on the moon again. I mean, the pandemic is probably the closest we're going to get to like Neil Armstrong, Buzz Aldrin type of news moment and commonality. And I don't think us landing on the moon would be as widely known as the pandemic or as it was last time.
Yeah, I think you might be right. I mean, for one thing, the mass media system that existed in the 1960s is gone. It doesn't exist anymore. I mean, you still have the big three TV networks, but the hell are, I don't even know what's on the big three TV networks anymore. And, and that's the thing. In the 1930s and 40s, everybody knew who Edward R. Murrow is. Everybody knew what the big radio shows were. In the 1970s, everybody knew about All in Family, whatever they thought of Archie Bunker's, racial opinions. Today, there's not anything like that, really. I mean, you kind of have that with memes, and if you look at Twitter, you have people jumping on things, but you don't have that commonality of experience the way you used to. And there's good things about that, but uh, it's I mean, on the one hand, I suppose you could make the argument that it makes it harder for those who control the media assets to be heard, to control the narrative. But on the other hand, I think we have ample evidence that that's not true. and and B, even if it isn't true, it means that in a sense we're more prone to the tribalism that we suffered from before the 20th century, which got us into a lot of trouble. So yeah, I don't know. I think it is inevitable that future um, triumphs and tribulations are not going to be shared the way they were in the past, and I think that's regrettable.
But do you think it would be inspirational, let's say, for people in Houston, Texas, as an example, to know that we're planning to send people back to the moon in 2024? I mean, like people in elementary school, middle school, high school,
Oh,
college.
absolutely. And I mean, the flip side of that is you have to remember too that we all tend to look at the age in which we live as the illegitimate bastard of all previous ages. When we were going to the moon, there were a lot of people who were giving speeches saying we shouldn't be wasting money going to the moon. And there were a lot of people who didn't believe it, and there were a lot of people who didn't know anything about it. They just didn't, have rallies in downtown Austin. So, everything I just said is with the somewhat jaundiced idea of, or a jaundiced eye of retrospect as well. It is certainly true that a certain segment of the population will take inspiration from that kind of thing, just as it is true that many of the population take inspiration today from the good things that our government and other governments do, from pride in nation, from pride in their military. I think what we need to do as a species is we need to be better at giving people the freedom and the access to take pride in things without having to denigrate everybody else. And I'll take as a somewhat trivial example of that, how nowadays there are so many Americans who love South Korean, K-dramas and K-pop, but that doesn't take anything away from our love of bluegrass and country and whatever it is that we like locally. Or we love British humor, but we still love, our own American comics, and vice versa. America, in spite of everything, is still loved by quite a few countries around the world. We have a lot of raw material to make the world a better place if we will focus on trying to make the world a better place instead of trying to concentrate power in the hands of 8 people.
I know that's true. But I'm just wondering, like the North Houston Space Society chapter. What do you think we could do in terms of organizing, promoting, educating, that type of thing? people in Houston about uh, the return to the moon and kind of like the steps we're taking there? I mean, like, what would work?
I don't have the answer to that. I can tell you that I try to do my little part by posting things, you know, pro science and anti nonsense things on social media. There used to be this concept of, well, I guess there still is this concept of speakers bureaus, right? Which is kind of like what you do with NSS, but in reverse. And I don't know. I don't know how productive that sort of activity is in today's world, because you know, if you have you can have the greatest speaker in the world, but if they're going around talking to 20 or 30 people at a time, how many people can they reach in a year? But um, maybe instead of a speakers bureau, we can organize a social media bureau and share advice with each other on what are social media platforms where you can make a difference and how to do it, and uh, you know, what kind of messages can be got across. I don't know.
Yeah, and some people mention that you kind of think about social media as being a collection of bubbles.
Yeah,
And if you have something that's specifically like science related or space related, you may be able to get penetration to those related bubbles, but you're not going to be able to get penetration to other bubbles.
yeah,
And the key thing is about finding something that can occupy two bubbles. That kind of
right.
allows for you to have like a carrier over into another bubble. Maybe it's like, that double tree promotion on the nanoracks thing to actually cook
Yeah, yeah,
cookies on the
right.
so now you got cooking and space. And then you have like something about maybe bike helmets and the biker
I th-
community.
I think the first porno to be shot in space might be going a little too far, but yeah, that basic idea.
Well, uh,
Actually, isn't wasn't there an announcement recently that Tom Cruise is going to be flying into space on a yeah, so
that's
I
the
think that's a
plan.
positive thing.
That's definitely a positive thing. You get some interesting
I mean,
things.
the downside of that kind of thing is if you're a science person like I am, is people will take an interest in that and they know nothing about it and they'll leap to ridiculous conclusions. You know, like there are a lot of people who think we have lunar bases now or think we've been to Mars. And so it's easy to look at that and think, geez, why do we even try? But I think that misses the mark, because there's always going to be people like that. I mean, I had a teacher in high school who told the class she didn't believe in buoyancy, even though she knew ships could float. But the explanation in our textbook didn't convince her. And I'm like, oi, what is you can't reach everybody, but the thing is, for everybody who speaks up and asks a stupid question like that, there are other people who maybe kind of thought the same kind of thing, but kind of knew what they were thinking wasn't right and didn't say anything. And those are the people you can reach. In my science writing on Quora, a lot of time I spent a lot of my time explaining basic science to conspiracy theory, or in answer to conspiracy theory type of questions. And I get a lot of people saying, oh, you shouldn't argue with them. I'm not arguing with them. You can't, arguing with them is like trying to talk to a stone. I'm arguing with the people who may be persuaded by that and aren't yet sucked into that irrational mode of thinking, who might listen and think, gee, maybe I should stop listening to that idiot and go listen to this Hardwood guy or somebody like him.
Right, right, or at least give them some competing ideas, so that at least
Yeah.
they have to make a decision to choose between the competing
And
ideas.
if all else fails, I can always give them a more entertaining conspiracy theory to believe in.
There's that. Um, uh, the other reason I've heard people say that we shouldn't go back to the moon is because we'll mess up the moon. That we will actually have a negative impact on the moon. And I wasn't prepared for that kind of thought, as I always, there's no obvious signs of life on the moon. I can't really see us messing up the moon if there's nothing on the moon.
You know, my answer to that kind of thing is that that is a laudable instinct, but it, it it's interesting philosophically, right? I mean, a lot of people are raised with this, they're taught from childhood that, there's right and there's wrong, there's good and there's evil. But if you actually think about it and put God off to the side for the moment, or put the Ten Commandments or whatever is your particular spiritual source of guidance, we all know, from no matter what religion, we pretty much have similar ideas of what's right and wrong, right? And it mostly comes down to things like the golden rule and treat people nicely. The universe doesn't have that rule. The universe will say, hey, your star's out of fuel, it's going nova, and you're all going to die.
Yes,
The
that's
universe does not care. The universe does not care if the moon is polished shiny as a billiard ball.
yeah.
If we want to do something with it, God is not going to get offended. I mean, if he does, he can, send me a text. It's on my website. But we we need to take care of the earth because it's the only place that we have. If there are any other places that we can make habitable to humanity, if there are signs of life there that we can preserve and study, I think we ought to do that because it's in our interest to preserve and study them. But it would be ridiculous to say that we live on this little grain of sand orbiting the sun and we should leave the entire other 200 billion galaxies alone so we don't spoil them. What the hell good are they then? I mean, don't spoil them if there's somebody there who says, hey, would you mind not spoiling this? I'm using it.
And you mentioned it, thinking about the future can be exhausting. Um, because there's so many different directions it can go. But
Especially when there's fireworks outside.
um, so I was, but if you were to put on your most optimistic hat and projection and look out like 500 years from now, how far do you think the humanity bubble has expanded? I mean, do you see, you said hotels in space, you think that next 10 years, and maybe we could do something on the moon,
in
Mars.
in 500 years, I think we will have a busy commerce in low Earth orbit, between low Earth orbit and the moon, most likely between the moon or between the Earth Moon system and Mars and or Venus. Um, Venus is a little bit iffy because, it'll kill you and it's got heavy gravity. Um, I would be surprised if we don't have at least mining stations in other places throughout the solar system. In part, just because I think that's human nature. I think there are a lot of people who are happy just to, hey, I just want to stay home and raise my kids. But a lot of people, they want to see what's over the next horizon. And a lot of people are, I can guarantee you right now that if I was given an unlimited amount of money and I emailed my newsletter as a writer and I said, hey, I have talked to Elon Musk. I can put anybody who wants to. We can get you to Mars, and we're going to send you with a casket, and you're going to dig a hole, and have some fun, and you're going to die on Mars and jump in the hole. I would bet you money I would get at least one person on my newsletter who would volunteer for that. What's the value in doing that? What's the value in doing anything? When I was a kid, I would have given anything to be the first person to walk on the moon. Now I wouldn't. Now I have other things that are more important. I don't want to risk my life. I don't want to go train for 3 years. It's a big pain in the butt. I got a novel I want to write.
But
But people in general want to explore. They want to see what's over the horizon.
they do, and then you see them stuck in front of their iPhones. But that's a whole nother
Yeah,
thing.
yeah. They'll be on Mars saying, "I didn't know there wouldn't be any internet."
Yeah, I know. I can't do my Twitter update.
Jeez Louise, how am I going to blog about this?
But they had that Mars One thing that went around and said, "Who wants a
Uh,
one-way ticket?" I know I. But aside from the fact that the whole thing was,
but they did get volunteers, right?
they did, and I was just thinking, how many of those volunteers really understood what going to Mars and living there would be like, versus were motivated by saying, "Oh, I could be Neil Armstrong or Buzz Aldrin," and that their real reason for wanting to go to Mars wasn't what they would do in Mars or on the way there or back, but kind of how it would enhance their perceived value of themselves once they got back here. And I
Yeah.
was wondering what you thought about that.
Yeah, well, I mean, you could ask the same thing about Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin, right? I mean,
Oh, sure.
I think Buzz Aldrin wanted to be the first man on the moon because he wanted to be the first man on the moon.
Absolutely.
And I think he was the second man to walk down the ladder because Neil Armstrong cared just a little bit about the other aspects of the mission. But I think Gene Cernan cared more about doing the science missions than he cared about those kind of things. That doesn't make Buzz Aldrin worse or any less of a human. God bless him. We need people like that. And I think we're at the point now, right now as we speak, where we're in a transition period, right? Again, where being an astronaut doesn't mean what it used to mean, and that's not a bad thing. But it comes with pluses and minuses. You hear these stories about Apollo 10 when they went down and made the practice landing on the moon, and they didn't put enough fuel in the ship to land, and the joke was always that they underfueled it so they wouldn't be tempted to land. Well, anybody who knows those guys knows they were not going to land. They were straight up serious test pilot guys. They were going to fly the mission that they were told to fly. But if you hire guys at a temp agency, that
Yes,
may not be true. 20 years from now, when you're hiring the cleaning staff for your orbital hotel, they're not all going to be Neil Armstrong.
that's
And
right.
so you're going to have a whole new problems. And as one of the fellows who's, I think, on the executive leadership of the new space source said when I met him at a conference 2 years ago, we don't know he was speaking for the U.S. Air Force at the time. He said, we don't know what's going to happen in space in the next 20 years, but one thing we do know is wherever there are people, they're going to need us to keep them out of trouble and protect their assets.
That's true. Well, right now there's 5 people in space, right, on the International Space Station. I think that's the
Yeah.
number. Um, when do you think we'll cross, like, say, 100 people in space at the same time? I mean, if you had to guess.
Oh, I would say probably within the next 30 years. The difficulty with that is there are multiple paths that we can use to getting there. Um, and part of it comes down to economics, and part of it comes down to what governments want to do. So there's, of course, you said there's 5 people in space. I don't know if the Chinese have anybody in space right now.
Not at the moment.
So, they have things going on. We have things going on. I know there's a module that's about to be added to the ISS. The plan is that it's going to eventually grow and then detach and be its own space station. I think it's entirely likely that before that happens, it will be outpaced by technology and there will be cheaper ways to build space stations. I think the way we built the ISS is preposterously expensive, even for something in space. I never understood how they managed to spend that kind of money. Um, even granted that, yeah, it's space and it's harder than it looks, but on the other hand, if you launch tanks the size of a shuttle external tank, you could have 100 people in space in a month. So and by the way, that's the size of a Falcon, of a couple of Falcon tanks. So I don't know. I mean, it could happen sooner than any of us might imagine.
I mean, theoretically, the Crew Dragon could carry 7 people, so you're just
Yeah.
looking at, less than 15, uh, Crew Dragons in space at a time.
Yeah, and I mean, and part of it depends on what people like Elon Musk or other people who are in the business decide to do. The the Falcon, which SpaceX is kind of talking like it's a dead end technology, even though it's pretty awesome technology. But one of the interesting things that they've done with that is they're not the idea isn't to fly the same hardware over and over again for 30 years like in an airline, but just to fly it enough times to get the cost down. And then on the last time you fly it, you can do something more useful, something more permanent with it, right? Whether it's crash it or do an experiment, like they've been doing that with experiments on landing and things like that. I could well imagine Elon Musk, for example, saying, well, I'm flying all these missions to the ISS, and my engineers tell me it's not practical to recover the upper stages, or if we can only do it once, and there's too much heat stress. So then you could say, well, this upper stage has flown once before, so we're going to leave it up there and do something useful with it. Well, once you start doing that, you're going to start building stuff in orbit. I mean, what else are you going to do with it? Once you're launching things the size of uh, a Falcon 9 stage into orbit, you've got habitat. It's just a matter of bolting on life support and dealing with a few minor details like radiation shielding and trivia like that. Um, Disney came up with fairly plausible means of turning things like that into a space station 60 years ago, 70 years ago now. So it could happen. And once you do that, then it's like send some people up there and it's vacation time. Y'all can film a whole movie in zero G and not 3 minutes at a time in the vomit comet.
When do you think we'll have our first human death in space?
Oh, um, before we have 100 people in space.
And how about the first baby born?
After we have the first 100 people in space. My friend Bill Ledbetter won a Nebula for a story about that, about a woman who got pregnant in space, and it was against the law, and it was a good story. Um, there's a whole, I'm sure you've heard Marion Dyson talk about that. There's a whole area of reproductive medicine and medicine as it pertains to women that has only, I mean, we've really only started to look at medicine in space at all. We focused up to now on the things that have been of highest priority to astronauts working for the government. But as we start spending more time in space, a lot of the other issues are going to be more important. And as soon as you start talking about certainly anything beyond low Earth orbit, things like reproductive science are going to be realistic. We can't send people to Mars who haven't either been sterilized or who do it with the knowledge that we can handle planned or unplanned pregnancies. And we certainly can't have a colony until we're capable of doing that. So if you're talking about having a colony, you're talking about the possibility that somebody could get pregnant and give birth before they get there in orbit. And if they can do that, they're going to do that, because I know for a fact people have been caught having sex in dumpsters while they're at boot camp in the Army. So don't think discipline is going to stop this from happening.
Of
So
course, they are the. I mean, professional astronauts are quite a bit different than, uh, the people going to boot camp. But
maybe.
maybe, but I don't know. We had the diaper thing, so
Yeah.
so maybe take everything back. You're right, silly me. Uh,
I mean, I'm letting my writer's mind, run away with me. But I mean, the fact remains, there's a lot of issues that have to be addressed, and the human body is not made for those environments. I personally am an optimist about those kind of things. I think a lot of the medical concerns are overblown. I think a lot of those things, they're problems, but they'll be manageable. And a perfect example of them is this bone loss thing, which, from what I've read, and I'm not a doctor, so I'm not an expert, but from what I've read, they're pretty sure that the majority of the bone loss in zero G can be prevented by simply doing weight-bearing exercises with the latest gear that they sent up to the ISS, where people are using like a NordicTrack elastic band type of a thing to give you something to push against. There are some other issues like people getting glaucoma and things like that that need to be dealt with. But I think those things will be dealt with. I've read studies saying it won't be practical to build a rotating artificial gravity in space because for the size that you would need to build it in order to keep the cost down, it would have to rotate too fast and it would make people sick. And my answer to that is, were any of you researchers ever in fourth grade? Did you ever play on the merry-go-round? Because I remember the merry-go-round, and I remember being in second grade where the older kids would spin it until we were all sick and we couldn't walk, and they, 2 years older than us, would walk back and forth across it while it was going that fast, and it didn't make them sick because they were used to it. And I think that's what we're going to find. There are some things that we have to research, and that we have to research all of them, but there are some things that we have to solve, and there are other things that we will just find that they're not as big a deal as we thought they were. And I personally strongly suspect we will find that living on Mars, as long as you keep your radiation exposure to a minimum and don't, walk out in the vacuum, you'll be fine. I don't think the low gravity is going to be nearly the issue people fear it will be.
It would be
Either
good to
for
find out one way or the other. Why?
Yeah.
Why? Let's go find out.
Well, the problem is going to be the first people to try to raise children on Mars. It's going to be a big deal, right? Because if you're wrong, those people might not ever be able to come back to Earth. I find that hard to believe. I think life is more adaptable than that. But if you're wrong, it's somebody's life. So yeah.
So if it was safe and affordable, would you go into space?
If it was safe and affordable, yeah, I'd
And
go.
how safe would it have to be? Like, how many people would have to go without incident before you're like, hey, sign me up?
Um, I don't know. I'd have to. I'm married to a health and safety expert, so I'd have to let her do some calculations.
Now, are you talking about like a suborbital trip? You would go in orbit for a week, maybe a couple
Well,
weeks to the moon and
it
back?
it would depend. I would definitely go if it was safe and affordable. I and my wife was willing to go. I would go to the moon. I absolutely would go to the moon. I think that would be a blast. And if she didn't want to go, I would go by myself because I know I would have a blast, and I wouldn't want to take her along if she was going to be miserable. And whereas I'm enough of a nerd, even if I am miserable part of the time, I wouldn't care. I don't have any interest in going beyond that, but I'm an old guy. When I was in my 20s, man, I would have killed 8 people to go to Mars. Like, get out of my way, I'm going. But I didn't have a family and a mortgage and all that kind of, that makes a difference.
Yeah, I mean,
What I don't understand is Elon Musk getting up there and saying, when we build a Starship, you'll be able to buy a ticket for, the price of a mortgage. Yeah, and where are you going to live for the next 30 years after you spend that money? You're gonna give up your 30-year mortgage and get a ticket and you go to Mars and be what, a janitor? How's that going to work? I mean, I know you're kind of rich and out of touch, Mr. Musk, but I got a degree in economics. I don't think that's going to work out.
yeah, he says, we can't even get there, so let's solve that. All these other problems, I agree with you, are a lot larger. How can you get a group of small people live in a highly stressful situation with limited resources that requires high tech that works all the time? I mean, there's no analogy that I could think of a similar type of situation here on Earth, because regardless of where you are on Earth, you're only hours away from
Right.
resupply and help.
Even if you're in a Civil War submarine,
Yeah.
you're only 3 feet from the surface. It does make a big difference. Now, having said that, I will say, in all fairness, humans who travel deep into the ocean are closer to death than humans that travel into space.
Hmm.
Right? If you're at the bottom of a deep sea trench in a submersible and there's a tiny leak, the jet of water coming in will cut you in half.
Wow.
And if your systems fail, there is absolutely no hope of you getting out alive, even if you're connected by a cable to the surface, because if your air supply dies, you're not going to make it. You know, you're going to freeze, you're going to run out of air. So it's not completely unprecedented. But on the other hand, we don't build cities at the bottom of the Tonga Trench for
Sure.
what should be obvious reasons. And interestingly enough, there's no real interest in building cities on the bottom of the sea. You hear that every once in a while, and Jacques Cousteau talked a lot about that. And there was, you know, Jacques Cousteau had some, and I think one of the Scott Carpenter talked a lot about that too, right? Like he thought there were going to be undersea villages for exploiting the assets of the sea. Nothing's ever been done with it, and nobody's, you know, little boys all over the world don't dream of growing up to be aquanauts, sadly, because I think that would be almost equally awesome. Um, so yeah, I mean, it is a big gulf, and it's a big difference between you know, in the age of exploration, when people would get together and build these wooden sailing ships and sail off to God knows where, they knew at least when they got there there'd be air. You know, they didn't know where India was, but they were pretty sure there was water in India.
No, but I do remember in middle school and high school for me, so this would have been like in the 1980s, marine biologist was a common career choice target.
Yeah. Well, yeah,
Lots of
I
people,
love marine biology, but you know, marine biologists don't go live on the bottom of the ocean. They
eh,
spend a lot of time on boats getting sunburned, apparently.
but I wonder, I mean, it'd be interesting. I wonder if there's some type of data out there about people's, you know, kind of career aspirations through multiple generations, you know, like what
Yeah.
were middle schoolers wanting to be in the 80s and what were they wanting to be in the 70s and what were the kind of interesting.
Well, you know, and there's also the question of, you know, what did we all want to be when we were 10 versus what we ended up being to put food on the table versus what would we have been best served as. I feel that I'm blessed because I blundered my way into a good career that I didn't hate every day, that I was able to make a better than average pay and raise my family. And then midway along the way, it occurred to me that that silly thing I always wanted to do when I kept stealing my mom's typewriter as a kid is actually something I can do and I'm pretty good at, and that's awesome. So now that's what I want to do, and that works out well because it turns out I'm actually kind of scared of loud noises, and I really wouldn't want to fly on a rocket. I mean, I would do it in exchange for an orbital view of the Earth, but it's not really my thing. I would never make it into NASA's astronaut corps because I'm quite sure I would be cleaning the cockpit out of that T-38 on every flight. I'm just not, I'm not that guy. I wanted to be that guy when I was a kid. Unfortunately, I didn't know that people like Gene Kranz existed who could, you know, do other parts of the cool exploring space thing. And so now I like to write about people like that so that the next generation will know that, hey, if you're interested in space, you don't actually have to go up on the big scary rocket to be involved in space if that's not your thing. But I digress. Uh, Part of that equation, what is the risk and what is it worth, depends on what you can make economically viable. Elon Musk makes a big deal out of establishing a multi-world species, and that's, you know, that's frankly not something that a lot of people care about. But people who care about it and buy into it might be willing to assume the risk just fine. Just like, you know, realistically, I joke about the age of the exploration, you know, but realistically, a lot of the people who got on those ships knew their odds of ever seeing England again were small. You know, they weren't going to not have air, but they were going to have also not have vitamin D. Uh, so then it comes down to if you can get them there and they're willing to risk their lives in order to build a colony on Mars, what do they do for a living and how do they put food on the table, and can they do the other things that humans typically want to do, which is, you know, find some significant other and raise some semblance of a family. How are you going to make that happen And if the answer is, well, when you get to be a colony, then you'll do it the same way that everybody else does it, then how do you get from here to that point? Because right now we're not anywhere close to that point. And that's, that's books can and will be written about that, I think, over the coming decades.
I think that's true. It's going to be a fascinating future. I hope it's more productive and promising and less conflict. Um, I've heard some people talk about pretty much, they felt like war with China was inevitable. Some type of economic collapse. It's just like lots of lots of negative scenarios.
Yeah, I don't know. You know, growing up during the Cold War, I have come to realize I always had a distorted view of all the participants. And I don't know enough about the Chinese people and Chinese culture. I have no illusions that they are any kind of great saints, that, as opposed to us. But on the other hand, it is possible that when people say war with China is inevitable, they're projecting our own paranoia. And people in China might think, we don't want freaking war with you. I mean, I'm not saying that's the case, but my experience has been most people don't want war. you know, um, most people in the Soviet Union didn't have any particular animosity against Americans. And if you learn about any culture, my experience has been you can't help but find people to take inspiration from. And so part of what I try to do as a science fiction author is bring more of that to life in my writing. My story For All Mankind, which was set back in the Apollo era, I did that, where I had an American woman and a Russian woman who I contrived to put into space on a suicide mission that was kept secret by both governments. And the reason I love that is because it let me illustrate their humanity. They were both Cold War citizens of their nations. The American was an American who didn't trust Ruskies, and the Russian was a Russian who didn't trust Americans. But they also both had their problems with their own culture, and it was a lot of fun getting to explore that. And I think that's probably a more realistic view of the world and of humanity than people who say, oh, war with China is inevitable. I think China would rather sell us cell phones than start a war.
I, yeah, I know you just worry about like Hong Kong, Taiwan, South China Sea.
Yes,
From their
yes.
standpoint, we're sort of meddling in their area, and they're like, you wouldn't put up with us meddling in your area, and then they're
Yes,
in
and
South
wars have
America.
started that way before, for sure.
Yeah.
So,
Well, was there any topic that you wanted to discuss that we didn't get to?
oh no, we've had a lot of fun. I would like to mention I'm in an anthology with Neil Gaiman and Cory Doctorow to raise money. Let's see, I go this way.
Oh, wow.
Surviving
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 Tomorrow
Tomorrow
anthology.
anthology.com. Bunch of famous authors that's raising money for COVID-19 testing. And I also did, for people who are interested in lunar exploration, Final Frontier is an anthology with a whole bunch of other award-winning authors, all lunar exploration stories. And those are available on Audible. Look at this, I'm like Vanna White.
This is great. Yeah. I'll have to put that in the notes. That's fantastic.
That's pretty neat, wasn't it? I just did that with my little virtual background thing.
Oh, so you have multiple virtual backgrounds and you just switch
Yeah, you
between
just
them?
switch from one to the other, and you look like you're doing the evening news. Pretty
That
neat.
is that is fantastic. Now, you mentioned something about editing. I
Yep.
haven't actually edited any of these 200 videos except for one where, somebody started talking about some personal stuff they had some trouble with. But I did pause it while you had to step away for a little bit. I just wonder if you had any strong feelings about me not editing it.
No, I don't. I do have some advice about editing it. If although you may not need it, if you're, I think for what you're doing, you only really need the ability to edit out little things like that. And I found that I think it's the Photos app in Windows is great for that kind of thing. It's really if you just want to edit over a little section, it's very easy. Um, I use a much more complicated tool. If you're ever interested, we can talk about it. We don't have to do it
Um,
right now online.
Actually, yeah, is it for Windows?
Yeah, it's called DaVinci Resolve, and it's free.
DaVinci. Okay.
But it is quite a learning curve. That's what I've used to do my Patreon video and my YouTube video. And I need to do another YouTube video. But see, the problem is when I started my Patreon and started doing YouTube, it was right before this whole pandemic thing started. And I was like, I can do these like when I'm working from home and nobody else is here.
But
That
everybody's
doesn't,
there. It's like my productivity's gone down, not because I'm not used to working from home. I'm just not used to everybody else working from
yeah,
home.
exactly. So I have, like people bringing the dog in while I'm trying to do things.
Yeah.
But it's all fun. It's all good.
And so you like DaVinci Resolve.
Yep.
Any tips on getting started with it?
Um, if I would be happy to talk to you about it at length. You don't necessarily want to do that right now, but I can send you some links to YouTube videos that I have found to be useful, or I can send you a getting start guide. But it's great. It has like there's some advanced features that you have to pay like a fair amount of money, but it's a serious tool. Like people use it to edit movies, and they give it to you for free, and they advertise their very expensive movie gear, and I'm like, I'm have no problem with that.
So they just pop ads into your video?
No, they pop ads to the splash screen when the thing starts up, and then it
Oh,
has a
okay.
fundamental limitation, which is you can only edit one project per startup. So like if you edit one video and then you think, okay, I want to go create a like an intro that I'm going to use over and over again. Well, you have to shut DaVinci Resolve down and load it back up, and then go create your new project and render that to an MP4 or whatever, and then shut it down, and then go back to your original one and load it back. But I'm like, I don't care. That's fine. I have no problem with that. It's I only do this occasionally, and it lets you do as much. You can do really fancy things if you want to invest the time to learn how to do them. But for just the basic stuff like cutting and editing and sequencing stuff and layering it up, so that you have your text and your background and your audio underneath it, it's sweet, and I've had no problems with it.
I had to
So,
check it out.
yeah.
Well, thank you so much, Stuart, for your time. I know it's kind of like last minute notice. Really appreciate you being
That,
available.
that's all right. I knew you were hard up, or you wouldn't be coming.
Yeah, I,
I,
I've I've developed a list of people I could call in a pinch. So that's good.
yeah,
So
and I knew when I saw you were doing this the other day. I'm like, damn, that's ambitious. And you're doing one every day, right?
one every day I've done. This is 201. I just have 1639 more to go.
Yeah. So I'm gonna have to watch them all, if only to get the names of people who I can hit up to do forwards for future books. Oh, speaking of which, I've been talking to Hugh Blair Smith, who was one of the programmers on the Apollo guidance computer.
Oh wow! Did
Yeah.
he write the book? What Star Crest or
Uh,
Starburst?
he did write a book. Well, he wrote a book about his experience doing the Apollo guidance computer, which I can't remember what it's
I
called right now.
I think it is Starburst.
But he's the one that the error they had on Apollo 11 that kept causing the computer to reset. He's
Yes.
the one that wrote the solution to that and put it into the software for later versions.
That is interesting. But yeah, I think I bought a book about the Apollo guidance computer. I haven't read it yet. I'm find it's a lot easier to buy the book.
Yeah. Well, see, that's another thing. When I was at work, I would buy audiobooks, and I would go to the gym every day and I would listen to the audiobooks, and I would get through them. And now I don't ever go to the gym. I go for a bike ride every morning, and I've just never have gotten in the habit of, there's no reason I can't. I've just never ever gotten in the habit of listening to audiobooks while I'm on the bike. I guess I should do that like a normal human being. I could adapt to my new situation.
Well, it's just I think hearing on the road with the bikes and the
Well, that's
cars.
the thing. I'm afraid
Uh,
somebody will run me over.
exactly. Exactly.
I have enough problems right now watching out for people, who don't have a mask and the occasional bat down by the bayou near where I live.
Now, if you played the audiobook on a speaker, it could have warned people that you're nearby and let you hear your environment
And
too.
it would warn people that you like science fiction, so they could,
That is true too. Phasers on stun.
I
Ah!
I actually went out on Zazzle and created a custom mask. You can create custom masks now, and I created one that has this science fictional background, and it says "I speak sci-fi," and then I thought, I should put above that, I should put the word "warning."
Red letters with the
Danger! I
colon
speak sci-fi.
notice.
Yeah.
Well, cool. Well, I'll let you go for the night and enjoy the fireworks. And thanks again.
All right. Thank you, sir. Good luck.
Okay, bye bye.
Bye.